Okay, so in this next video, we're going to use the foliage tool. I'm going to give you the basics of that. In the last video, I got you at the very end to grab a prop from the props folder. If you've got the starter content, you can access it from there. If not, you can import your own project objects, or get them from the web or something like that. Yeah, and just click and drag that. I've clicked and dragged it into the top of the contents browser just for access. And if I click and drag this, first open the foliage tool. It's the one that looks like a plant. If I click and drag that in, it's going to create me a foliage type now, which will be my rock. And now it's just as simple as placing them down in the level. It's going to take a minute to think as well, because it's having to kind of put these down for the first time. And just from even now, just looking at these, you can see that it's already a pretty boring thing to look at. It looks like something from a Ridley Scott movie, and that all these are kind of all uniform and all pointing in the same direction and look like a bunch of eggs. So we need to kind of make these look a little bit more dynamic and interesting, because at the moment they don't look very interesting. If you're wanting to get rid of a bunch of these in your level, you can obviously click on Do, or you can go to the lasso select and just go across your level, just delete them. So if I just switch back to the paint tool, there's a couple of things that we're going to want to change to make these objects a bit more interesting. The first and foremost is actually not in the landscape tool, sorry, in the foliage tool. It's actually going to be somewhere else. So if I run through this object, you can see that this isn't a very good rock in that I can kind of pass through it still. Now the reason for that, by default, is that in the foliage tool, collision is set to be off. Now the reason for that is obviously if you've got like a trillion blades of grass, by default most, quite a bit of foliage, things like bushes or grass or things like that, aren't going to need to have collision. Things like trees will, but those can obviously be defined as you need them. So, but by default collision is set to be off. So in this case we're going to switch it to be block all, and then just plonk down a couple more rocks. But the problem still is you can still pass through them. So what is the reason for this? The answer to that is, let me just actually I'll leave them in the level. The reason for that isn't actually anything to do with the foliage editor. It's actually the object itself. If I hover over this, you'll notice that there's a yellow kind of highlight that says the number of the amount of collision this object has is set to 0. So if we open it up, you'll see usually if you have an object with a static mesh, a static mesh you've got on your level, they have kind of a cage around them to represent the collision of the object. This doesn't. So one thing that's very nice about the Unreal Engine is that you can create yourself some basic collision, and it is basic, but it allows you to kind of, rather than having to nip back into some kind of 3D editor, make the changes and bring them back in. You can make all those changes in UE4. It doesn't handle things like concave objects very well. So if you're creating something like a like a house, or some kind of tunnel or shelter, or post box or something like that. Sorry, post box, telephone box. Don't know why. Yeah, but anyway, if you're creating something with a concave shape to it, you're going to need to create that collision in something else, because it doesn't handle it very well. But as for something like a rock, it handles it pretty well. If you click on this top tab here, you'll see that there's a bunch of different collision types. I'm going to choose 26 for this. I've looked at each other option, and it's essentially defining the number of edges and sides your collision will have. 26 doesn't do too much, kind of push your computer too much, and that still gives you a reasonably good collision box to work with for your object. So if I just save that now and try running around, I should now Oh, almost. Yeah, you can see it now, but I'm trying to land on it. But you can see I can collide with this object now, which is great. That should be useful for us. So from here, we can now begin making changes to these objects and kind of changing them in kind of interesting ways. So I'm just going to select all of these and delete them just for now. Now the place that we can make the most changes to our objects is if I drag down the content browser, drag up the palette, you'll see that I've got this great details panel which is filled with all sorts of different variables and things that I can change. The ones that I'm going to start with though is probably the most significant in its kind of appearance. Most of these objects are sat right on the surface and it looks kind of weird, especially since it kind of thins off at the bottom. So to address that, we're going to alter what's known as the Z offset. Now, the maximum's a little bit easier to illustrate, so I'm just going to crank that up to something much higher. So this, you can see that it alters its position, left and right based on its based on its positioning. But the one thing it doesn't change much is its position from the levels, the object that's been placed on. So by altering the Z offset, in this case you could have things like floating rocks. The more realistic option would be to have rocks that are sank, they're sunk into the environment at different heights. So if I set that back to 0, the maximum, and put the minimum down to something like negative 250, you'll see that immediately these rocks look a lot more dynamic than they did previously. Once again, you might want to turn the lighting off just to make sure you can see the environment a little bit better. But compared to how they were before, these, the stones are kind of a bit more varied in their structure. So that's the first thing we can change. The second thing that we're going to alter is the actual random pitch. So what this is going to do is, based on the original position of the object, so with it stood vertical, we're going to vary that and give it a random range to kind of rotate the object in. So you can see now, it appears to be even more random than it was previously. We may need to tweak that value a little bit, just because obviously a lot of these rocks are getting lost in the ground, but don't worry, we're going to be changing one variable in a second that's going to make a big difference to that. But you can see that there's a lot more, compared to where we began, where it was just the rocks kind of uniform and pretty much the same across the board. They're a lot more varied now, with some kind of weird imperfections as well, which we can also address in a moment. But you can see that this is looking a bit more varied, if not a bit saturated. So what we're going to do from here is we're going to alter, you can always go in and further and kind of tweak these a bit more, but there's going to be one more variable I'm going to be covering, which is going to be, I accidentally undid that value, which is going to be its maximum and minimum scale. So I'm going to set this to a maximum scale of 5. And what that's going to give me is these really nice kind of huge rocks to kind of plonk in my environment, to kind of really flesh the landscape out, and it gives you a little bit more, it gives them a greater scale, and actually you can build some pretty good landscape pieces with this, just this object alone. Sometimes it gets it a bit off, as you just saw there, with it kind of bulging out of the environment, which is a bit weird. Mostly good though. Now there's a really good talk by the team from, I think it's the art team from Campo Santo, the team behind Firewatch, and it's them talking about how you can use a very small palette of objects to create a really kind of diverse environment. You know, so they were showing how with just a small collection of rocks for the game, they were able to create all these different spaces through things like rotating objects and kind of changing their scale and things like that. Definitely worth a watch. Very good talk. And yeah, with just a kind of a bit of messing around and placement, you can see that we've got this very kind of varied environment coming together. And then when you chuck your lighting on, it's going to look a little bit better. We probably need to rebuild the lighting for the level, because we haven't done that since we've added the foliage. And something that you might want to do as well is, if you've placed these objects in your level, you might also want to go back to your original texture, and if you've got, for example, a section where you've got like a rock on a hill, if you want to make that look a little bit better integrated, you could go back to the texture and just add a bit more, just blend it a little bit better into the environment, just to make it look like it's actually meant to be there. So yeah, that's. Oh, and another thing as well. This rock is quite pronounced from the environment. Looks a little bit weird, considering how ridiculously top-heavy it is. So I'm just going to tweak this a little bit. So the way I can do that is if I go to back to the foliage tool, you'll see that there's this thing called reapply mode. Now, what's great about this is I can essentially take all the objects I've got on the level, choose one variable that I want to change. So I'm going to choose the Z offset and just kind of bring this down a little bit, and then yeah, just apply that individually just to this one object. And that way just kind of bring this object just down like a little bit more, just to make it a little less pronounced. Actually don't know if I'm alright with that. Yeah, that looks okay. That'll be fine. Whoops. Obviously I'll need to rebuild the lighting, having now got a big weird shadow on my landscape. But it's good to know that you can kind of come in and tweak all of these different things and do that on a grand scale if you want. Yeah, so let me just very quickly rebuild the lighting. The other great thing as well is, once again, you'll see here that there is just one foliage type here, and you can toggle these on and off. But you could have like 5 or 6 of these, foliage things set up, and in turn, with that, you could have you could flesh your whole environment out with. Let me just quickly show you an example of this. I don't know if I'll be able to drag another one in. Oh no, I don't think I can. Unfortunately, not. No. But yeah, if I had like 3 or 4 different types of, a couple of types of rock, and a couple of types of plant, I could have these all grouped as one brush. So as I paint across the map, it would essentially show, it would place all of these objects down simultaneously, rather than having to do one pass for grass, one pass for, trees, one pass for bushes. That saves a lot of time. So from here, the last thing that I kind of want to cover with this is this section up here, which is, it'll only take a minute or two just to explain. But if some of you have been building your levels with BSPs, or your levels filled with static meshes, you might not want rocks, growing off the top, or plants or things growing off the top of your buildings. So what you can do is you can turn off static meshes and BSPs, and, toggle them on and off. So you could cover an entire environment with stuff, but avoid coating, military bunker or your farmhouse with you know, trees. So yeah, let's just kind of give that a quick play. You can see now this is probably a little bit imbalanced. There's a lot of rocks in the middle and not much going on around the outsides, but you can see it's looking a little bit more interesting than it did previously. We've got some hidden rocks up here, and yeah, you know, it's a little bit more dynamic than it was previously. You know, I've found that this is a bit of a dead space up here, so I'm just going to chuck another rock up here, and that might actually work quite nicely as whoa, too much. You can also alter things like the density of, you know, the object, and yeah, it's quite a nice tool to be able to kind of have a mess around with. So yeah, that's kind of wrapping up on the foliage tool. On the next one, I'm just going to kind of quickly go through some post-processing effects, and then we're going to get into matinee. So yeah, tune in for the next video.